welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 65. The Man Who Lived Too Long. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we covered the Great Battle of Myriokephalon, the battle where Kılıç Arslan II, the Sultan of Rum, had absolutely crushed the Roman army in Civitare Pass, and Manuel Komnenos' attempt to reverse the verdict of Manzikert had failed miserably. Turkish rule of Anatolia had been confirmed, and the hearth of the Turkish nation had been lit. And today, we will cover the aftermath of Myriokephalon and Kılıç Arslan's consolidation of power in Anatolia. But we will also see the aging Sultan begin to slip, and as he enters his 70s, make what will turn out to be a colossal error. An error that will, ultimately, cause the limping lion to repeat the failure of his namesake, the first Kılıç Arslan, and leave the Sultanate of Rum utterly and completely unprepared for a massive army preparing to invade Anatolia from the west. An army summoned eastwards by the great triumph of yet another sultan. So to begin, Kılıç Arslan II stands triumphant at Myriokephalon. The Roman armies were in shambles, and his rule of the Anatolian plateau was confirmed. However, the limping lion did not really press his victory as much as he could have. As with his decision to not destroy the Roman army at Myriokephalon, this has sort of confounded historians ever since, in particular Greek and Western historians. The reality is that we just don't know why Kılıç Arslan did not storm down to the Aegean after the battle and reconquer the rich valleys and ancient cities of Western Anatolia. He certainly was in a position to do so, but he clearly decided not to. However, while we don't know for sure, we can make some educated guesses. Firstly, it is crystal clear that the limping lion's real goal at this time was securing his control over Turkish Anatolia. That is, the plateau itself, the upland highlands to the east, and the passes to Syria, Iraq, and the Middle East. Remember, Nureddin Zengi's death had happened only a couple of years before Myriokephalon. This had caused the rival alliance opposing Konya to collapse, and Kılıç Arslan himself had thus been in the process of consolidating his control over Anatolia when the emperor invaded. Fundamentally, that was why he wanted to make peace with Manuel Komnenos, why he did not want war in the first place. And now that the emperor had been defeated and his own legitimacy had been enhanced, the Sultan felt he could return to that task. The unification of Turkish Anatolia was, by far, the most pressing item for the Sultan. We should also bear in mind that the Seljuks of Rum, particularly at this point in their history, valued their eastern lands more highly than western Anatolia. There were a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the constant raiding in the west and the devastation brought by the Crusader invasions meant that the border zone of western Anatolia was, at this point, sort of devastated. The imperial territories on the coast were of course wealthy, as were the fertile valleys leading down to the sea, but the further inland you went, the grimmer the picture looked. The eastern lands, by contrast, included wealthy trading cities that profited off the Silk Road trade. Furthermore, the eastern lands were critical to retaining the connection of Anatolia to the heartland of the Muslim world in Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Anatolia was a frontier world, and the connection to civilization, as the Seljuks would have seen it, was of incredible importance. We see this in the constant wars for Malatya and Marash, the bitter struggles to control the economic, political, and cultural connection points with the heart of the Muslim world. Additionally, the eastern lands, particularly the southern marches of Anatolia, held cities that had long been a part of the Muslim world, and were therefore more prestigious in the Perso-Islamic context than the Anatolian frontier lands. And also, having larger Muslim populations, they were easier for a sultan to rule. And though this is more speculative, there may well have been internal political factors holding the limping lion back. Remember, the population of the Sultanate of Rum was overwhelmingly Christian and Greek-speaking, though with substantial Armenian and Assyrian populations as well. These Christians, in particular the Greeks, still looked to Constantinople as the spiritual center of the world, and in some ways still saw the empire as the font of political legitimacy. This was a major reason why recognition by the Emperor of the Romans, the legal fiction that Constantinople had delegated the right to rule Anatolia to Konya, was so important to the sultans. It may well be that Kılıç Arslan II was therefore wary of killing the emperor or escalating the war with the empire. Indeed, he was likely also reticent to conquer more areas populated with even more Greek Christians. Therefore, in the West, Kılıç Arslan primarily saw the victory at Myriokephalon as providing an opportunity to relieve pressure from the tribes. Remember the ever-present dual role of a Seljuk sultan: to act as both a proper Perso-Islamic ruler and as a steppe warlord. For years, Kılıç Arslan had been restraining the ability of the tribes to raid in the West. Naturally, this had not been popular among them. And furthermore, as we will get into shortly, this period, the late 1170s through the 1180s, was a period of increasing tension between the court in Konya and the wild tribes. Partly, no doubt, this was because of the cooking of the court, as the Chinese would have said, the increasing sedentarization of the Seljuk sultans of Rum. The dynasty of Kutalmış had come to power in Anatolia about a century ago by leading the wild tribes. Now it was becoming increasingly sedentary, increasingly Perso-Islamic, as the state continued to solidify in Konya. However, there were certainly other causes. As we will get to later in the episode, there were great tensions with the tribes in eastern Anatolia that would eventually boil over. But we see increasing references to Turkish raiding in the Georgian and Armenian sources as well in this period, primarily raiding into Armenian Cilicia in the southwest and into the Kingdom of Georgia in the northeast. Though our sources are not great, it is clear that the relationship between the court and the tribes was deteriorating, even if the specifics of that deterioration are poorly understood and little attested to. These increasing tensions between the court and the tribes led Kılıç Arslan to essentially unleash them on western Anatolia. Freed by the terms of the Treaty of Myriokephalon to raid Byzantine Anatolia, Kılıç Arslan basically told the tribes, "Go for it. Just go for it over there in the west if you wouldn't mind." just as the founder of the great Seljuk Empire, Tuhrul, had seen Anatolia itself as an excellent release valve for the tribes, now, over a century later, the limping lion saw Western Anatolia the same way. A place where it didn't matter if the tribes went on the rampage, where that rampaging might even have some benefits to the court. Therefore, the years after Myriokephalon saw a massive expansion of raiding of Western Anatolia by the tribes. Indeed, the very next year, 1177, saw a massive Turkmen raid of the Meander Valley under a bey who Niketas Choniates calls Atapokes, almost certainly his rendering of the Turkish title Ata Bey. Choniates says that the Turkish advance was stopped only by the sea, meaning that the raid went as far as the Aegean itself. However, this Turkish raiding party was defeated by a Byzantine force led by John Vatatzes, a relative of the noble who had gotten himself beheaded trying to take Niksar. Vatatzes ambushed the Turkish army as it crossed a bridge over the Meander near two fortresses called Hielion and Laomokir. The Turkish army was, reportedly, almost entirely destroyed in the engagement. Now, Choniates naturally plays this up as a great revenge for Myriokephalon, and says that the Turks were greatly chastened. Now, this is clearly a bit of an exaggeration, and this raiding party probably had a limited connection to the Sultan himself, but nevertheless, it probably did put a damper on the willingness of the tribes to campaign so far to the west. This engagement was followed by further inconclusive Roman campaigns in western Anatolia, some of which resulted in Roman victories, but some of which saw Turkish victories. And of course, the emperor dragged his feet on the promised destruction of the fortresses at Dorylaeum and Sublaeum. But while the Byzantines were of course now obsessed with this war and the raiding of western Anatolia, this was actually not a major preoccupation of the limping lion. In reality, the Sultan was little concerned with the raids of the Turkmen in the west, so long as it kept them occupied and more or less happy. Instead, Kılıç Arslan was again focused on the perpetual obsession of the Roman sultans, Malatya. To catch us up, when Nureddin invaded Anatolia, Malatya was ruled by his vassal Afridun, the Danishmand Bey of Malatya. Afridun had succeeded his brother Fahreddin, who had come to power in 1170, when he drove out Nasreddin Mehmet, either a cousin or yet another brother. Nasreddin Mehmet had then fled to Nureddin, the Crusaders, and then ultimately to Kılıç Arslan. The Roman Sultan had ultimately given Nasreddin Mehmet the city of Ereğli in Cappadocia, the place where, decades earlier, the crusade of the faint-hearted had met its end. But now, with the light of the faith dead, Nasreddin Mehmet was able to take his revenge, and he rode to Malatya, killed Afridun, and came to power for the second time in 1175, now as a vassal of Konya. Then, in 1177, right after the Sultan's victory at Myriokephalon, Nasreddin Mehmet was induced to give up his throne in Malatya. Reportedly, the reason was that a bad harvest had made him extremely unpopular, and fearing a revolt, he instead elected to retire and turn Malatya over to the Sultan of Rum. Finally, Malatya was under the direct rule of Konya. Kılıç Arslan II had fulfilled the dream of his father and grandfather. With his control over Anatolia thus cemented by 1178, the limping lion began looking south, towards the lands of northern Syria and the southern marches of Anatolia, where, many years earlier, he had started his career as a marcher lord installed in Elbistan by his father Mesud. So what has been happening in this region? Well, as you can imagine, the death of Nureddin Zengi and the subsequent invasion by Saladin led the Zengid Emirate to basically totally collapse. And this collapse, naturally, complicated the relations between Kılıç Arslan and Saladin, as both sides began rushing in to fill the power vacuum created in northern Syria by the Zengid collapse. Now, the relationship between Kılıç Arslan and Saladin seems to have been tense basically from the get-go. Remember, Saladin had started out as a lieutenant of Kılıç Arslan's greatest rival, Nureddin Zengi. For Saladin's whole life, the Sultanate of Rum was therefore basically an enemy of the state he served. Furthermore, the death of the Light of the Faith had led both Saladin and Kılıç Arslan to scramble to gobble up the possessions of his state, and thus naturally they came to see each other as rivals. The limping lion began meddling in the affairs of northern Syria basically immediately after Myriokephalon. Indeed, in 1178, the Emir of Aleppo, a son of Nureddin named As-Salah, was pleading with Kılıç Arslan for aid in opposing Saladin. Kılıç Arslan agreed, and As-Salah would enjoy Seljuk support for the remainder of his life, which ultimately wouldn't be that long. Then, in 1179, Kılıç Arslan attacked Raban, a fortress town near Antep in southern Turkey. Like nearby Maraş, this had once upon a time been a possession of the Sultanate of Rum. However, this seizure of Raban further raised tensions with Saladin, as As-Salah had been forced to cede this very territory to Saladin when the great conqueror had entered Syria after the death of Nureddin Zengi. This was followed by further provocations, as Kılıç Arslan attempted to lock up the southern marches of Anatolia. In 1180, the Sultan threatened his son-in-law, the Artukid Bey of Hasankeyf in Diyarbakır, Nureddin Muhammad, and demanded the return of several key fortresses on the edge of the plateau. The proximate cause of this was, supposedly, that Nureddin Muhammad had tired of his wife, that is Kılıç Arslan's daughter, and had distanced himself from her and taken up with a female singer. And remember, at this time, singers and actors were basically the bottom of the barrel. That said, though, I think that this was probably little more than an excuse. Frightened, however, Nureddin Muhammad turned to Saladin, who offered support. This incident fed into the growing tension between Kılıç Arslan and Saladin, and Saladin even began assembling armies to march against the Sultan of Rum. However, not eager to go to war with the great Saladin, and, as always, ready to negotiate, the limping lion did what he basically always did in these situations. He dispatched Ihtiyar al-Din Gavras from Konya to negotiate. This makes Ihtiyar al-Din Gavras, I believe, the only person to have personally met and negotiated with both Saladin and Manuel Komnenos. Saladin, for his part, was ready to defend his position, but he was also now preoccupied with the unification of northern Syria and Iraq and his wars against the Crusaders, so he did not really want a war with Kılıç Arslan. Thus, Gavras and Saladin came to a deal, though I would note that Ihtiyar al-Din seems to have been an excellent statesman and diplomat, which seems to have played a big role here. Indeed, Michael the Syrian says that Emir Hassan, by which he means Ihtiyar al-Din Hassan ibn Gavras, speaking words of wisdom, made peace, and they did not fight. The deal struck was that Nureddin Muhammad would return to his wife, Kılıç Arslan's daughter, and the fortresses would remain in the hands of the Artukid Bey, as his beylik basically became a buffer zone between the two sultans. As a concession to Kılıç Arslan, Saladin agreed that the forces of the Sultanate of Rum and the Ayyubid Sultanate would jointly invade Armenian Cilicia, in short, an agreement to carve up a mutual rival. This led to a little attested to assault on Cilicia in 1183, which itself would eventually be followed by Saladin's own larger campaign against Cilicia in 1186, as he prepared the ground for a march on Jerusalem. But while he was trying to focus on the East and his relations with Saladin, events were forcing the limping lion to gaze back to the West, forcing him to deal with the situation in western Anatolia instead of the rising power of Saladin. Indeed, an event of almost unimaginable geopolitical importance had occurred. On September 24th, 1180, Manuel Komnenos died in Constantinople, almost exactly 4 years after his humiliating defeat at Myriokephalon. The gambler emperor was 61 years old when he finally cashed in his chips and left the table. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the twists and turns of the succession to Manuel Komnenos. That really is not the purpose of this podcast. If you are interested, do listen to the History of Byzantium podcast. However, we do need to do some background to explain the coming events in Anatolia. Basically, Manuel Komnenos was succeeded by a young son, Alexios Komnenos, called Alexios Porphyrogenitos, that is, born in the purple, as he was born to a sitting emperor. However, as Alexios Porphyrogenitos was a minor and, by all accounts, intellectually and emotionally immature even for his age, a regency was established. In time, the crafty Andronikos Komnenos, a cousin of the late Manuel, would be summoned from Paphlagonia, where he was staying with the Seljukids, to take up the regency. And I think we all know what happens next, right? Of course, the crafty regent, Andronikos, had the young Alexios strangled and dumped in the Bosphorus and declared himself emperor in 1183. And naturally, this power play was not going to be universally accepted. Soon enough, the future emperor, Isaac II Angelos, would be raising the flag of revolt in Iznik, that is, Nicaea. Zooming out, what all this means is that the death of Manuel Komnenos caused great instability and chaos in Constantinople. This drew Roman forces from the Turkish frontier inwards, towards the center, and it also made the various players in the unfolding Byzantine Game of Thrones look for muscle, making them naturally think of the Turks. This led much of western Anatolia to fall into chaos, effectively a low-grade civil war. Choniates writes, "The Asiatic cities were fraught with internal strife and wars. The actions now taken were more grievous than those undertaken by neighboring enemies. In other words, whatever the hand of the foreigner did not pluck, the right hand of the inhabitant reaped. The kinsmen, ignoring the laws of kinship, went to war against one another as though they were barbarians." This environment of chaos was irresistible to the Turks. And so it was that the Turks, and above all the aging Sultan of Rum, became drawn into the world of Byzantine politics. This involvement began basically immediately. Mixing his classical analogies a little bit, Choniates tells us, "The Sultan of Iconium, like Tantalos, forever in dread of the rock suspended above his head, I speak of Emperor Manuel, on learning of the latter's departure for the nether world, took possession of Sozopolis by the law of warfare, and pillaging the surrounding towns, he brought them under his dominion. He afflicted the most splendid city of Attaleia with a long siege, sacked Kütahya, and compelled many other cities to submit to him." In a flash, the limping lion had conquered a pocket of the interior of western Anatolia, the mountainous lands to the west of the upland lakes, near to Myriokephalon itself. Sozopolis was, by this point, merely an island of Greek imperial control in a sea of Turkmen bands roaming the lands around it, and it would soon become the center of Seljuk administration of southwestern Anatolia. Niketas Choniates mentions later Turkish raids encroaching as far south as the environs of Antalya, and it seems that much of the mountainous region inland from the sea now fell into Turkish hands. Indeed, many modern historians, like the famous scholar Claude Cahen, believe that this period must mark the beginning of mass Turkmen migration into southwestern Anatolia. While the Sultan himself was primarily focused on southwestern Anatolia, however, other Turks made other advances as imperial control over western Anatolia loosened. In Iznik, the local population called upon the Turks for aid in their war against Andronikos Komnenos, and bands of Turks seem to have been employed by both sides in a battle fought between John Vatatzes and forces loyal to Emperor Andronikos. This battle took place near Philadelphia, modern-day Alashahir. Following the battle, several Byzantine nobles even fled to Konya, seeking refuge with the Roman Sultan. We also have a reference to Turks saving the life of a relative of the future Emperor Isaac. Later, Turkish troops would be used by a man named Theodore Mangafas, a Byzantine rebel who arose in Anatolia to seize Alashahir itself. Mangafas himself would eventually flee to Konya after his defeat, where he will continue to play a role in our story. So by the time of the accession of Isaac Angelos to the purple in 1185, the Turks had made advances everywhere in western Anatolia, in particular in the southwest. The Byzantine position in western Anatolia, strengthened during the reign of Manuel, at least up until Myriokephalon, was now weaker than it had been in decades. But as in the days of the first Sword Lion, this situation was about to be upended by a new invasion. And in order to understand why that invasion would turn out to be so devastating, we need to look at what happened in Anatolia now, in the late 1180s. And the most important thing to remember is that by now, the Sultan of Rum was really getting on in years. He was in his 70s, an old man, especially by the standards of the Middle Ages. And like other Turkish rulers before him, he was beginning to think about the succession, but there were a couple of complications. Firstly, Kılıç Arslan II had 10 sons. That's right, 10. And that's on top of a brother and a nephew still kicking around. And remember the Turkish rules of succession. Every member of the ruling family has a claim, if he can win it, and the state is divisible among the claimants. And spoiler alert, with 10 plus claimants in the running, this is going to lead to a massive disaster. As his life neared its end, the limping lion was grappling with how to deal with this, the upcoming civil war that everyone could see approaching. Secondly, as I discussed earlier, it is apparent that the tensions between the court and the tribes were really escalating. Now, we don't really have great sources, but what we do have, in particular the writings of Michael the Syrian, indicate that there was even some sort of uprising of the Turkmen. The locus of this uprising appears to have been Diyarbakır, the great city of southeastern Turkey and an area primarily inhabited by Kurds. Basically, it seems that tensions began escalating between the Kurdish peasantry and the nomadic tribes, the old story we've seen before. The conflict between farmers and herders for the use of the land. We don't know why this conflict became so extreme in this region in the late 1180s in particular. Some scholars think that perhaps more tribes had arrived from the east, a forerunner of the coming Turkmen mass migration that will come to flee before the Mongol advance. Interestingly, Ibn al-Athir states that the late 1170s and early 1180s were a time of drought in the region, which perhaps caused tensions to rise. The late 1180s also saw the deaths of two Artukid beys in the region, men who could have helped contain the tribes. But regardless of the reasons, all of these tensions boiled over. Matthew the Syrian mentions attacks by Kurdish villagers on Turkmen nomads as a proximate cause, but I am sure that there were lots of attacks on both sides. The result was that the Turkmen of the region assembled under the leadership of a bey named Rostam, the name of the great hero of the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, and a war broke out between the tribes and the Kurds. Michael the Syrian says, "In this period, there was warfare between the Turks and the Kurds, and the disturbances lasted for 8 consecutive years." Matthew mentions several battles, including one in which 30,000 Kurdish warriors assembled at Nusaybin, confronting what he calls countless Turkmen horse archers. That is to say, extremely large armies by the standards of the Middle Ages. Now, though both sides won battles and lost battles in this brutal war, the end result, as you could probably guess, was the victory of the steppe riders. There really were no equals to the mounted Turkish horse archers, and the tribes were ultimately victorious. A victory that, as you can imagine, involved horrific slaughter of Kurdish villagers. Rustam then led his new tribal confederation in raids to the south, deep into Syria, and even into the possessions of the Principality of Antioch. In 1187, the Turkmen would raid up the river Orontes, devastating the land, until they were defeated by the Prince of Antioch, Bohemond III, in a battle in which Rostam himself likely fell. But all of this complicated the succession problem bedeviling the limping lion. While the East was the main hotspot of tribal unrest, as we discussed earlier, there was increasing tension between the court and the tribes everywhere. Furthermore, the fall of the Roman Empire into civil war had drawn the tribes west, just as the Sultan had pushed them west to get them out of his hair. But the end result of all of this unrest and the movement of the tribes in the years since Myriokephalon was that there were now powerful tribal leaders on the fringes of the Sultanate in both East and West. Leaders who could easily jump into the middle of any succession dispute. The limping lion knew that his death would kick off a struggle among his sons, a struggle in which the claimants would now be able to call in unhappy and restless Turkmen tribes from all directions. Furthermore, with restless tribes everywhere, there was a need to contain them on all sides. It was in this context that the limping lion took the unusual step of dividing his realm. In 1186, the Sultan decided that his sultanate was to be basically partitioned among his sons, the future claimants for his throne. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the names here, but there are two I would like to mention in particular, including one I'm going to introduce in full. First, Rukn al-Din Suleiman Shah, the future Sultan Suleiman II, was given Tokat in northern Anatolia just north of Sivas. And secondly, and far more importantly, the youngest of all of the limping lion's sons, the future Sultan of Rum and the rival of Suleiman Shah, Khusrev I, was given the newly conquered region of southwestern Anatolia, centered on Uluborlu, Kütahya, and Sozopolis. Now, Khusrev is going to be one of the most fascinating sultans of Rum, and he is sort of a personal favorite historical character of mine. His name comes from a king in the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. In Persian, the name is Khosrau. Khosrau was one of the great mythical kings of pre-Islamic Iran. This was, of course, a sign of the increasingly cooked, increasingly Perso-Islamic nature of the Seljuk court. But interestingly, Khosrev was the son of Kılıç Arslan and a Greek woman, likely of noble origin, and thus reportedly spoke Greek with native-level fluency in addition to Turkish. This made him a good fit for the western lands that his father had just gifted him. But Khosrev was also given a classical Perso-Islamic education, covering religion, Islamic philosophy, and Arabic and Persian poetry, most importantly, the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, from which his own name came. He was thus taught Persian and Arabic, and he mastered both of the prestige languages of the medieval Muslim world, in addition to speaking his native Turkish and Greek. Incidentally, I would note that in the Shahnameh, Khosrau is very similar to Khosrev in that he is half Turkish. In his case, his mother was a princess of Turan, while his father was the Shah of Iran. And as we will eventually see, Khosrev will ultimately come to bring all of these strands together in his person and in his career. And Khosrev I is going to be with us for many episodes to come. Other sons of the Limping Lion were given Niksar, Aksaray, Sivas, Niğde, and Ankara, while the Sultan's lone surviving brother and his nephew were given Ereğli and Amasya respectively. Indeed, the aging Sultan kept only the capital of Konya for himself, and all of these new governments were then registered with his central divan. The Limping Lion was now positioning himself as basically the center spoke, the coordinator and overlord of what was now basically a federation of his potential successors. Why Kılıç Arslan did this is sort of hard to understand. It certainly carried risks. Any of these Seljuk princes would now have a base of power from which to attack the Sultan. Furthermore, the state that had been painstakingly built into the master of Turkish Anatolia during the reigns of Mesud and Kılıç Arslan II would now be divided into 10 or more mini-statelets, any of which could be overwhelmed. Indeed, predictably, this is going to end very, very badly. However, there must have been reasons, albeit reasons that are somewhat unclear today. Maybe the Sultan was worried about growing tension in Konya and wanted to satisfy his son's impatience to rule, impatience that might boil over into patricide. After all, their father was positively ancient by medieval standards, meaning that his sons had been waiting for a long time. Maybe he wanted to make sure that each of his sons got something, and that he stayed alive. My personal favorite theory, proposed by Claude Kahan, is that Kılıç Arslan was worried about the Turkmen unrest, and wanted to make sure that there was a Seljuk Bey in each part of the Sultanate's territories who had the power to deal with the tribes. Perhaps this was particularly important as the Limping Lion aged, and thus felt more confined to Konya. We just can't know, but whatever the reasons, the result was a disaster. Indeed, I think that the Sultanate, and even the Sultan himself, would have been better off if the Limping Lion had died before this had happened. Had he died in the early 1180s, he would have been remembered as one of the greatest Roman sultans. The man who held together the Sultanate after the death of the great Mesud, who had finished off the hated house of Danişmend and crushed the Romans at Myriokephalon, confirmed Turkish rule of Anatolia, and finally united the whole land under the rule of the House of Seljuk. Indeed, it's quite telling that all of the beys he appointed across Anatolia were Seljuk princes, a sign that there was no one left to contest the rule of Anatolia, at least to the west of the Saltukids, the Mengucikids, and the Artukids. Indeed, the limping lion lived too long. As the years kept passing, he stayed alive in Konya, growing weaker and weaker, until finally, as the tribes became increasingly restless, he was forced to effectively divide his sultanate while still alive. This plunged the Sultanate of Rum into chaos, as, predictably, each of his sons was soon working to make sure that they would become the next Roman Sultan. And thus, the partition of 1186 ultimately led the Sultanate to begin to fall apart. Jealousies and rivalries broke out among the claimants, now basically the beys ruling Anatolia on behalf of the Sultan in Konya. And as these rivalries broke out, as incidents kept bubbling up, the aging Sultan was forced to take sides. This naturally made him unpopular with those relatives he had sided against. And furthermore, with the tribes now restless, the various beys in each corner of the Sultanate were able to find powerful allies and friends among the wild tribes to prosecute their claims. In short, whatever his aims were when he divided up the Sultanate, the Sultan of Rum had, in effect, basically started the war for succession ahead of schedule, while he was still alive. The first of these major struggles broke out in 1189. Probably attempting to overthrow his aging father, the eldest of the limping lion's sons, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah, who had been set up in Sivas, decided to try to take the throne in Konya for himself. Basically, install himself at the top of this rickety federation that Kılıç Arslan had set up. Interestingly, Michael the Syrian tells us that the proximate cause was some sort of disagreement between Ikhtiar al-Din Gavras and Melik Shah. But I think whatever the proximate cause was, the underlying reality was that it was sort of inevitable that something like this was going to happen. The unstable system instituted by the aging Sultan made it sort of a matter of when, not if, some dispute or jealousy would combine with plain old ambition to start a war. And completely unsurprisingly, Melik Shah decided to launch his campaign in alliance with the wild Turkmen. As we have seen over and over again on the podcast, unrest among the tribes provided fuel for the ambitions of the princes of the House of Seljuk. And so, Melik Shah raised up a great army of Turkmen and marched from Sivas on Konya itself. However, naturally Melik Shah was going to be opposed by those other claimants who didn't want him to win. Men who, when they looked in the mirror, saw themselves, or maybe their allies, as the next Roman Sultan. And thus, when Melik Shah's army made it to Konya, he was opposed not just by the forces of the Sultan, but those of the other claimants. Now, we don't have details of the battle, but it is clear that Melik Shah lost, though not totally. He was not killed or captured, and instead some sort of truce was reached, apparently through the intervention and arbitration of one of the other sons of Kılıç Arslan. Melik Shah retreated back to Sivas, where he would continue to conspire against his father. However, there were casualties. Michael the Syrian tells us that Kılıç Arslan ordered the execution of 4,000 of the Turkmen who had joined Melik Shah and had been captured in battle. And the Sultan agreed to dismiss his greatest advisor, an opponent of Melik Shah and many of the other claimants. The great Ikhtiar al-Din Hasan ibn Gavras, the scion of a noble Greek family and one of the greatest grand viziers in the history of the Sultanate, was forced to resign from his post. Gavras requested that he be permitted to retire in Erzincan, a city of the northeast in which the Gavras clan had long roots, and which, as we will get to later, was ruled by the Mengucikids. The Sultan granted him permission, but as he was traveling east, laden with gifts and treasure to fund his retirement, he was waylaid in the mountains. Somewhere east of Sivas, his party was ambushed by a party of Turkmen, and the Grand Vizier was killed. His possessions were ultimately assumed by the Mengucikid Bey of Erzincan, Bahram Shah. Bahram Shah may of course have been complicit in the murder, though of course Melik Shah is also a suspect. And so passed Ikhtiyar al-Din Hassan ibn Gavras, one of the greatest Grand Viziers in Turkish history and one of my personal favorites. Thus, as the snows began melting in 1190, the Sultanate of Rum was in total crisis. The aging Sultan in Konya was still nominally the master of Turkish Anatolia, but he was facing growing Turkmen unrest, boiling over everywhere, and conflict and even revolt among his would-be successors. The positively ancient Sultan now stood at the top of an extremely rickety and unstable sultanate, really a fractious federation masquerading as a sultanate. And everyone seemed to be sharpening their knives and waiting for him to die, with some of his sons doing more than just waiting. All of this would have been bad even in the best of times, but this might have been the worst possible moment in history for the Sultanate of Rum to enter into such a period of crisis. Because it was in May 1190 that the German Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, crossed the Hellespont and brought his great crusading army to the gates of the Sultanate of Rum. So next time, we will journey back in time and we will discuss one of the greatest victories in Islamic history, the very fall of Jerusalem itself. And we will see shock and horror spread throughout Europe as the Latins, bent on vengeance and on penance, launch the most storied crusade of all time.